I find it fascinating that sometimes cultural technology trends will dictate horror subject matter. I remember in the early to mid 2000s, there was a couple of the evils of cell phone kind of movies. Then in sort of the 2000 teens, we got a lot of computer video chatting chat rooms horror movies. And so now we are into, well, all devices, no matter what they are all connected in a way that is harmful. Come Play is a 2020 horror movie about an autistic boy who begins to be visited by a creature named Larry that manifests itself through electricity and through device screens. Now, this movie was a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde for me. Now, on the one hand, I really liked the visual style, the use of shadows, silhouettes, and lighting. The creature's not shown often, but when shown, it's only in bits and glimpses, which I think really helps it sell it in a great way. The child performers are really good. Now, sometimes, kids can be a bit of a wild card, but all the kids here in this movie feel mostly natural, especially the main kid who is dealing with a kind of autism where speaking is just not possible for him. And there are a lot of really good moments and sequences here. Like, I really like the use of the patient camera work and the practical trickery. Like, sometimes I can point to very specific moments in films that really get me on board. Like, it's kind of like I'm chasing a train or something and I can't quite reach the running train. And then something happens and I feel a shift and I can get on board. And it can be big or small, but that shift in attitude and attention happens, and it's always great when it does. And this one had a moment like that in this very long sequence where Sarah, played by Jillian Jacobs, has to replace a series of light bulbs in her house. Now that sounds pretty silly, but it just reminded me so much of the original Poltergeist, and it became such a pivotal moment for me in getting me on board with this film. Also, the lack of music in spots was a refreshing choice. I think one of the most underrated effects filmmakers can use is to remove music from scenes. Like, we are so accustomed to hearing music, especially the horror music cue tropes, that by removing the music, it's actually more unnerving because we no longer have an auditory indicator as to where the tension is. Like, we know as an audience member that when music is rising, we won't get the scare until it reaches its pinnacle and then drops out. But by having no music, it's like being dropped into a land without a map. Now, on the other hand, the story is a bit more of a mixed bag. Now, where this movie stumbles, in my opinion, is in some of the motivations and the rules that it implores. And if you're sick of me talking about rules, like, join the club. But I think it's one of the things that can change a horror movie from something that you're just paying attention to versus something that you're locked into. Like, when things don't have a predictable consequence, then I think as an audience, we lose focus on it. Like, imagine this knife fight from Kill Bill, and if Vernita Green just kind of pulls out this knife and gets back up. Immediately, the stakes are gone, because we now don't know what's a lethal blow and what isn't. And that, consciously or subconsciously, confuses us, and thereby makes us not trust it. I mean, geez, just look at the new Indiana Jones movie for that. I mean, this movie doesn't have anything so blatant, but it did have some bumps that confused me enough to really bug me. Now, the movie itself centers on a family of Oliver, Sarah, and Marty. Oliver is an autistic boy who's trying to navigate life the best he can and learning with the help of SpongeBob SquarePants. This movie does a really good job of making us feel his stress and loneliness that he has to deal with having this disorder, and how alienating it can be. Now, Oliver can't speak, or actually I should say he can physically, but he has a kind of mental block on it. And so he has to use his phone in order to communicate.
Something. In. House.
Now, this constant use of his phone to go along with the alienation from others gets the attention of this thing that is living in his phone as well as other devices. It's a little foggy on that. But one night while going to bed, a children's story appears on Oliver's phone about a creature named Larry. And as he reads this story, a bunch of lights start flickering and things begin to move around the room, and it scares the hell out of him. Okay, so to go any further, we're going to have to kind of get into some spoiler territory. So if you don't want to hear this, skip ahead. Now, this children's story continues to kind of pop up on both his phone and really any and all devices that are within the region of this and baits anyone into reading more of the story. But the problem is, no one ever gets to actually read the story because every time someone tries to, all this crazy paranormal shit starts happening, which then stops them from being able to read it. Now, one of the things about this movie that kept sticking with me is I got very confused as to everything around the creature and the children's story. Now, it's told to us that the creature lives in a kind of parallel world and utilizes electricity to travel around, and screens are needed in order to come in and out of said world. Okay, that's fine. Then why does it keep blowing out the lights? Like, doesn't that seem to cause more problems for it because it now can't travel through them? And I should say, just as a side note, this movie also doesn't have an inciting incident. Like, everything is just sort of fine, and then it's just not. Like, Oliver just gets this random children's story to appear on his phone all of a sudden. Now, it's told later on that the reason Larry appeared in front of Oliver is because Oliver is lonely, and Larry manifested itself in order to cure his loneliness. Now, on the surface, this is all good, and they also hint at an incident where Oliver lost his only friend Byron because Oliver hit him, and then Sarah decided, I guess, he just shouldn't be around other kids anymore. As a backstory, this all works. But the problem is, all of this is told to us in an expository way very late in the movie. Now, I think this might have been a stronger story point if we're actually shown this incident in the beginning, thereby seeing the breaking point that causes Larry to come into the picture in the first place. I mean, as it stands, we open the story and everything just seems kind of fine, and then this children's story just kind of appears without any provocation. It's a small thing, but I think this kind of thing makes a difference. If you were to start this movie with that incident that breaks apart the boys, then that serves as kind of a leaping off point, and everything that follows after that becomes much more organically made, and the audience is on board through the entire process. Now, to go a step further into the Larry thing, I also just never quite understood if Larry was actually there or not. Like, the entire movie's premise centers on Larry constantly wanting someone to finish the story in order to allow it to fully come through so he can take Oliver back with him into this other dimension. Great. But that doesn't track with what we see. Now, he can clearly affect electricity by blowing lights and can only be seen through the camera of a device. But it also seems to interact with our world just fine. Newspapers hit him in the parking lot. He attacks a kid in the kitchen. He gives Oliver a sponge, lifts Oliver up in the ticket booth, and seems to be able to move things around without too much of a problem. Like, to me, that means he is tangibly in our world. But yet, it can also travel through walls and go great distances at insane speeds as though our physical world doesn't even apply. Well, until it does, but that's another thing. So which is it? Is it a creature that is already here and can interact with everything in our world? Or is it just out of phase and needs to finish the story in order to come through? Now, if you want to say that he can be in our world but can only bring back Oliver once the story is finished, well, okay, but then why? Like, what is it about finishing the story that gives it so much weight? Like, also, how much is Larry actually responsible for? Like, he seems to be around even before the story appears anywhere, like in the parking lot booth that Marty is attending at night. Also, at one point, Oliver loses his phone in a field after some kids bully him, but then his dad kind of randomly finds an iPad at his job. Like, did Larry do that as well? Like, is that a coincidence or is that just luck? I mean, I know they wanted to have the phone in the field for later on in the movie in order for the creature to travel there. But the fact that he loses his phone and then they so quickly just happen to find an iPad, I don't know, it just felt a little bit of a cheap way to get out of a writing problem. When I saw this, to me, it made it seem like Larry actually put that iPad there, which is also kind of silly. But those are the kind of inconsistencies or questions that I think take away from the movie for me. I will say one of the stronger elements of the film is when Larry tries to connect with Oliver and show him that he's not bad and just wants to be his friend. And I wish we saw more of that. I wish we saw more of him basically coaxing Oliver and trying to get him on his side, maybe pitting him against his parents in some way. But the problem is all of these coaxing scenes is constantly at odds with Larry continuously doing these aggressive and dangerous things to both Oliver and everyone around him whenever someone starts reading the story. Like, like apparently he's never heard of "you catch more flies with honey" saying. All right, last thing I'll say about the story element is all the rules about the reading the story essentially go right out the window towards the end of the movie when it basically just reads the story itself and then comes through. Like, what? Why didn't it just do that from Jump Street and you could have just taken Oliver on the first day? Like, that's like if Beetlejuice could have just said his own name 3 times. And I really do wish they fostered this connection element a bit more, because having Oliver need to be a willing participant would have been a really interesting one. And it actually would have lined up with how the movie ends, with Larry not taking Oliver, but instead offering himself to Oliver, which was a really nice moment. Also, it ends up being a great character beat for Sarah, who ends up sacrificing herself in order to save her son by offering to be Larry's friend. This is all really good stuff, but it ends up working against what the rest of the movie has told us. Almost like the movie wanted to have it both ways. It wanted to have this sympathetic creature who's trying to coax Oliver into being his friend, but then also wanted to have the very traditional monster tropey scares that you would have in a monster movie. Final thing I want to say is I love Gillian Jacobs, but I did find her a bit miscast here. It's not that her performance was bad, but I just didn't think she fit in this role. Now, I don't know if it was a directing thing or what, but I found her character kind of waded into the self-focused whining. Well, all right, whining might not be the best word there. Maybe pleading territory of acting most of the movie. Now, that style works really well when she's doing like comedy roles, but in this it just feels a little off. Now, the thing with whining as a performance choice is it's a very selfish emotion. It means that it's all about you, which some of that makes sense, where her arc is the realization that she needs to put his needs first over hers, but that also hampers her character as someone the audience will sympathize with. And after a while, it becomes a little one note throughout the movie. It also ends up holding her back as a main character that we're supposed to be rooting for. Overall, I just had a really hard time evaluating this movie because there are things that it does really well. There is definitely a real craft here that I appreciated a lot, but there are story elements that either didn't make sense or hamper a cohesive story that I think held it back. Now, there is a nice message here about our collective adherence to screens and how that isolates us as a society, but it decides to sort of blatantly tell this later in the story instead of just kind of trusting its message to come through. I'd give this a B-. But before I ask you to let me know what you think, I do want to say that it is officially, with the release of this video, been 1 year of me working on this channel. And I just want to take a minute to thank all of you for your comments, your feedback, your watching, your likes. All of it has been hugely helpful for me because I have learned so much over the last year, and I hope to do so in the future. And so, thank you again, and as always, let me know what you think.